Hi, welcome back, Stephen. How you doing? Thanks for joining me today.
Good. Thank you for having me,
Hey,
Al. Good to see you.
yeah, you as well. Thanks for making this happen. It's been something that I've wanted to do for a long time. And just for a quick background, when you were with Culture Amp a couple of years ago, you came in and spoke at a PAFOW conference, and you just made me pause on several occasions, and I was like, God, there's so much room to innovate and create and make a positive difference in this space. And so thank you for that. And since then we've stayed in
Of
touch,
course.
and I followed your great work. So I really appreciate you being here today. If you would, you mind introducing yourself and what you're up to now?
Sure, of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephen Huang. I'm the managing partner at a DEI consulting firm right now called Collective. We're a collective of strategists, facilitators, subject matter experts doing full scale DEI work globally. But before that, I was head of diversity and inclusion at a company called Culture Amp. I was there for 5 years. And there I helped build D&I technology that other companies used. So we had about 3,000 customers by the time that I left. But I got my start in people analytics. So I was the first people analyst at Facebook and at Square as well. So I helped build those people teams. And before that, I was a life insurance actuary. So data brain, and have found my way into really tackling this problem.
Well, I'm glad you found your way to this problem with that database
Yeah.
background, because it's massively valuable. So let's just jump right into it. You and I connected recently about the need to measure more in this space,
Mm.
and uh, exploring why organizations aren't going deeper to truly understand
Mm.
what's happening in this regard. Can you just, what would you advocate, given where we are here in late summer of 2020? What would you like to see different moving forward in terms of how diversity, equity, and inclusion
Mm.
is measured?
Well, I think for people analysts, I guess I'll tell a story. Is when I was doing people analytics, I was thinking about diversity and inclusion, but it was a sliver of my job. Um, and I was just curious. I was like, well, wait, why are women getting hired at lower rates? Why are people of color not getting promoted at the same rates? Why are women leaving at higher rates? And just like, as a people analyst, we break down these questions and we look for answers in the data. And that's kind of the mindset that I want every people analyst, people analytics person or team to adopt in 2020 as this diversity issue, is at the surface. Like, get curious, apply the same lens you do towards span of control and other things that you're working on to the diversity problem.
With that in mind, there's a lot of things a people analytics professional could do. There's a lot on the mind of a CHRO. I certainly have my answer, but I would love to hear yours. Is why
Yeah.
should DEI be elevated to the top priority, in their minds?
Just, if you're looking ahead, I feel like a good people analyst, a good executive is looking ahead at the trends. This has been a trend for a while, and maybe you've been able to ignore it up to now, but there was a wall between what we talked about at work and what we didn't talk about at work. Race, politics, those things were on the other side of the wall, but that wall is gone now. It's not coming back.
Mhm.
The world is getting more diverse naturally. We're getting more polarized. And so being able to lead inclusively and build a diverse workforce really is a critical business function. Just like everything else in the business, it is up there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I also, correct me if I'm wrong, it's just simply the right thing to do. And it's the necessary thing to do, to your point.
Mm.
And then it invites the question, how? How on a personal level, how on an organizational level. So if you're a CHRO who's guiding a people
Mhm.
analytics team, or sharing your needs in this regard, I can't imagine your solve is, well, take this training program online and check the box and move forward. What
Right.
is, in your view, the way to get started and make this a sustainable way of being individually and organizationally?
Mm-hmm. From a CHRO's point of view, I would think there's one important principle we have to abide by, which is that we cannot confuse a change in conversations for a change in outcomes. I think that's really important to really wrap your head around. One stat that kind of blows my mind is that since the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2014, it's gotten bigger every year, and this year is really a groundswell of this movement. Since that movement started, more Black people in America are killed by the police every year. And so we often confuse, we think that we're solving this problem because we're all talking about it, but we can't confuse a change in conversation for a change in outcome. So if you are a CHRO or if you are a people analytics leader, look at the outcomes. No, I'm not saying don't do training, but what are the outcomes that you want to achieve? And use your people analytics team, CHRO, to help measure those outcomes. That's what we're here to do.
No, I celebrate that so much because if the outcomes aren't moving in the desired direction, a change needs to happen, an intervention, something needs to shift. So in terms of diversity, inclusion, equity and inclusion can be esoteric in terms of what to do about it. It relates to hiring, it relates to assessment, it relates to communication, a variety of other processes within an organization. So from that perspective, what would you advocate? And let's, if you don't mind, fast forward to the ideal future state, because I know many organizations are a bit stuck. And they are kind of have this legacy thinking that's carrying the day. But what would you like to see as we move forward in the years ahead?
One of the big things I am starting to see slowly in smaller organizations that are not as risk averse is collecting more data. In order for us to measure disparate outcomes, or if outcomes are equitable or disparate, we need to capture data. So we have gender data and we have race ethnicity data. But inherently that's problematic because white men don't feel like they are part of the solution or part of the issue, for that matter. And so by collecting more data, by collecting sexual orientation data, by collecting disability data, socioeconomic status, parental status, native English speaking proficiency, these are all aspects of diversity that we need to measure. The companies that measure that are like, oh, wow, people with disabilities are scoring 10 points lower on this engagement survey on every question. There's a disparate experience happening. And if we don't capture that data, we're not able to see it really clearly. So I think that's something that I would love to see, is capturing more data, more kinds, more social identity data that you talked about, some of these chosen things, some of these inherent genetic things about us. We need that data collected to be able to analyze hiring rates, promotion velocity, equity, through all of those demographics.
And with that in mind, why do you not believe this data is being collected more regularly? Is it afraid of the consequences? Is it a legal matter? I mean, what are your thoughts there?
I've heard every excuse. And some of them are, some of them are valid. Every excuse is valid in some way. But so I'll talk about some of the excuses, right? If you capture this data and you're holding it either confidentially in a third party, you have to trust the third party to do it, or you're going to put it in your HRIS, which I recommend, but then you're holding that data. That data could be subpoenable in court. Let's say if someone's like, I felt like I didn't get a promotion and they asked me my race ethnicity, so that must have played into it. A lot of people are risk averse in that sense, that if the data is there, we will get sued because we have that personally sensitive data. And so that's probably the excuse that gets used the most, I'd say. And I think the millennial and Gen Z workforce are kind of fed up with it.
Right. Yeah, as well they should. I mean, it's to your point, it's the right thing to do. It's a necessary thing to do. So correct me if I'm wrong, it takes a level of courage and fortitude for leadership to say, okay, this is just what we're going to do because we have to do it. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I won't tell you which companies, but the leaders that I have worked with, they're like, we get sued, we get sued. I would rather get sued for trying to wrestle with the issue and have the data to do it than get sued because we didn't and all this disparity were formed and something bad happened. Like when you have the data, you can see the problem more clearly and you can actually solve it. Pretending the problem doesn't exist, I think, is riskier, and it leaves yourself open to, legal risks down the road. So I'm all about capturing that data now to be able to act on it.
Yeah. So, I'm hearing you. There's risk on either side. Is that right? Whether you do or you don't.
Yeah, and I think it takes a bold leader to Nike as an example, with the whole Colin Kaepernick thing happened. And they're like, we're going to support Colin Kaepernick because we're selling to the next 30 years, not the last 30 years. The next 30 years of customers and employees, they care about mental health at work. They want you to see them for their full identity. And so they expect that the culture and the values and the policies are equitable.
Historically, and I'm speaking from firsthand experience here, the way that we did engagement surveys, culture surveys, was we did once a year, sometimes once every other year, big bang thing. We would get the engagement data back. Because we did not understand the data very well, we created focus groups and interviews and went in there, and we found that, okay, well, now we're hypothesizing based on anecdotal feedback that, let's say, LGBTQ people aren't feeling as respected or involved, or some narrative like that. However, that lacked credibility because it lacked the data. So what I'm hearing you say is that for that to really be a systematic problem requiring a systematic solution, we need to actually go and get the data and think about the culture that we want to create beforehand. Is that a fair way to think about it?
Yeah, and it's kind of simple when you think about it. Like you take sexual orientation data, like, oh, we have this like feeling of this perception that like people of a minority sexual orientation are having a different experience at work. Okay, survey them, look for the differences. You know what a standard deviation looks like, and like, oh yeah, they're about standard deviation lower. Maybe it's in certain teams. Maybe it's in certain locations. Like we know how to solve these problems.
Yeah, right. And so, as we do these type of analyses, and I'm sure you have been a part of these or have influenced them throughout your career, is there are councils. As I mentioned at the introduction, I was part of a diversity council. I've also have contributed to others preparing decks, that would go to the board. So as we influence at executive levels in terms of creating the case to move forward, elevating this to priority, what are some of the metrics that you would advocate be on those dashboards or in those presentations to actually create not only a compelling case to move forward, but how to show that we are having truly a equitable and inclusive culture?
Yeah. I've been speaking to a lot of CEOs and C-suites in legal action, going through it right now. And they all tell me that they felt blindsided by this. They're like, I cannot believe this is happening under my own nose, and I didn't have the data to understand that this was happening. And for a lot of them, they were seeing diversity data. They were looking at representation data. And that is half of the picture. And you cannot be strategic or avoid a lawsuit with half of the picture. Like we need to be thinking about inclusion. We need to be measuring inclusion in a sustainable way. And it is a bit hard because to look at inclusion data, sentiment data, you would look at a survey, how are men versus women feeling, looking intersectionally, how are white men feeling versus women of color on things. And you end up with 1,800 benchmarks because you have different combinations of different demographics. Don't go there. What I think one thing that you can measure is belonging. In my research, belonging is the most correlated to engagement, and it's even higher. That the level of correlation is higher among underrepresented groups. So you can just ask that question in a pulse survey or in your engagement survey: is, I feel like I belong. Split that result by different demographics and just have the delta be a metric. I almost don't care what the overall score is. That's not true. I care more about the delta. Like for a lot of companies, like, great, I scored 85% on belonging, and the benchmark is usually 80%. It moves up and down every year. And they're like, that's good, right? I'm like, it's good. Let's see how your straight white men are feeling. Oh, they're at 95%. Great. What about your non-white men? 90. Okay, your white women, 85, and your women of color, 60. So like that 35% delta is a single number that you can measure. And if your belonging delta gets too big, you have an issue. That might not show up in your diversity data if you've put all your resources into diversifying your workforce.
Yeah, no, I love it. What I'm hearing, there's two things that pop to mind. Internal benchmarking is arguably more valuable than external benchmarking in that example. And two, belonging has a variety of different dimensions. So in IO psychology, we talk about the notion of reference. So if I feel like I belong, I can be thinking about my team. I can be thinking about my immediate manager. I can be thinking about the organization in the whole. I can be thinking about just my workplace, my floor on the building, for example. So just that two notions. Your feeling on benchmarking, would you advocate the internal versus external, although both are valuable, but internal would be more valuable? I just want to get your take on that. And just to the other question about the dimensions of belonging and understanding that to a level of actionable detail.
Yeah, I guess I'll answer that question first. As we were building this survey at Culture Amp, it's probably been, oh God, since I left, it's probably been used a lot. I think when I left, there was about 50,000 responses. And belonging was one of our dimensions that we were seeing. Does this impact engagement? The correlation to engagement was so high that we're like, maybe this is actually an outcome that like belonging does belong in the 21st century as more of an engagement marker, the way that workplaces are kind of forming. So I often think about belonging now as an outcome, and then you can correlate belonging to things like decision making, fairness, voice, psychological safety, those kinds of things. And in terms of measuring like a internal benchmark versus external benchmark, I think external benchmarks are helpful. But you know what? Not a lot of companies are scoring well in inclusion right now. Like I would sit down with companies and they're like, we have a 20-point gap between white men and women of color in decision making. I was like, oh, that's not that bad. And they're like, what? I was so desensitized to seeing 20, 30, 40, 50% gaps in companies that I was started to get desensitized to it. Like, oh, 20%, like you're actually like doing better than most. And they'd be horrified. And I would be horrified that that seemed normal to me. And so, for a lot of companies that rely on external benchmarks, that's good. Culture Amp has a great set of benchmarks that I think are available for free now. But when you get the results, brace yourselves, because you're going to want to set incremental internal progress goals.
Well, those goals, obviously we're in a situation where remote work is the norm. It's something that we're all dealing with. So how does that affect diversity, equity, and inclusion, and this creating this sense of belonging? Have you seen any data yet? What do you believe is going to be happening in this new normal, if I can call it that?
I haven't seen the data yet because I'm not at Culture Amp anymore, but there is a COVID survey that is, and the data is there, and I hope they put it out soon. I'm a pessimist these days. So I assume that because our world is so unequal right now, that it's not going to balance itself naturally. I think in a pandemic, you know, the working class are taking the brunt of the disease, and I just don't think that like we're naturally going to get more inclusive without conscious, concerted effort. I think things tend to veer away from where we want to go.
So similarly, like systemic racism is not going to be fixed without a systemic solution. What I'm hearing is diversity by its very nature, diversity, equity, inclusion is systemic in nature. Thus, it needs a systemic solution. Not many organizations have taken that approach. Thus, now we're in this situation where the influenceability, arguably, of the organization and the culture is less, then you are feeling that it's probably going to exacerbate or stay the same. Is that what I heard? Fair summary?
I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. I honestly do. There are all these
Yeah.
articles coming out, right? Like, oh, people with disabilities have been advocating for work from home for a long time, and like maybe they will benefit, and maybe some groups will benefit. But overall, I feel like maybe our biases are going to get flared up a little bit more because we're not in the same space. So maybe I'm just going to be going to the people that I know, or when layoffs hit and roles were eliminated, were people doing the analysis to ensure that all groups or some groups didn't get hit harder than others? And anecdotally, I would love to see the data, but anecdotally, I don't think that they did. And I think a lot of underrepresented workers were let go.
Yeah. So, yeah, I hope you're wrong too. I hope I'm wrong too, because I share that sentiment. And then it invites the question, and I teed this up. I don't know if you heard it, is that many organizations had a senior person leading diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they were under-resourced. It was largely an influence role. So for an organization to be successful in creating a culture that is truly inclusive, that creating the sense of belonging among diverse people, what do you think has to happen systematically? Is that individual taking a different tact? Is it that they're resourced more with a budget or people? I mean, what do you think needs to happen?
Yeah. We could talk for an hour on this. And there's a bunch of
hire you and Hello Collective. You're welcome for that. No, but I know it's a tough question. It's just
a lot of heads of D&I, their impact is unfortunately muted because the leaders don't understand truly how it is their job to make sure that the workplace is equitable. Like, I think a head of diversity and inclusion, or a head of DEI or DIB, whatever acronym you want to use, can have a seat at the table to bring it up. But ultimately, I've spoke with a lot of CEOs that don't know if it's their problem. They haven't been able to tap into their own DEI story to be able to advocate authentically to do the work. And if the leader doesn't get it, or isn't willing to go on the journey to get it, because it is a journey. A journey implies it's like there's an endpoint. It's a process. If the leader's not there, I think you can't be successful. And there's a lot of turnover with the head of D&I, chief diversity role, because I think a lot of us, and this is not my case, I'll put that out there, but for a lot of people, there's a lot of disillusionment. It's like, I'm not going to be able to make progress if my CEO doesn't get it or doesn't believe in the research. They're like, oh, it's just correlation. It's not causal.
Got it. And what I'm hearing is that the leader would have to move beyond, this is something that we should do, to something that we need to do because it's right culturally, it's right humanistically, and it's right for the company. Would you agree with that assertion? Yeah.
Yes.
As we start
I think they.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I think they can pick one reason. They don't need to pick all three. They need to pick a reason. It's the right thing to
Okay.
do. It's good for business. It's good for the culture. I don't care what your reason is. Pick one and believe it.
But make it yours. So as we start to wrap up, how can people learn more about you and Hello Collective?
Yeah, sure. So you can find me on LinkedIn. Or you can go to it. We're just called Collective. Our website is hello-collective.com. You can learn more about kind of the stuff that we do. We are swamped as a Black-owned DEI firm, and many firms are. But you can follow us on Instagram too. Like our Instagram is fire. Our head of marketing, Eden, posts really amazing, engaging content to follow along. So you can follow us on Twitter. You can follow us on Instagram. Go to our website and check us out and everything that we offer. And do the work. You can Google things. Google is a wonderful resource.
Yeah, it is, and you are as well. And congratulations on what you have done over the course of your career to advance this space. Look forward to learning more about what you're doing with Collective, and wish you the very best. And hope we can get together in person before too long. We're neighbors here in the San Francisco Bay Area. So again, thanks for joining me today, and wish you all the best.
Thanks for having me, Al. Good luck.